about work, about justice, about the future. And none of this is new. I could hear the pain of the people who lived and died here. The ruins of an early factory and the discovery of a forgotten cemetery open a window into the lives of captive Africans.
There was a lot of value placed upon any enslaved person who was working within the iron industry.
Deaths in bondage become crime scene evidence.
This boy is only about 14 years old.
But how far does the evidence go? Are there names?
These are direct descendants of Henson Summers. Come on, tell me all I need to know.
It's like working a cold case.
What really happened to the forgotten workers who built America? Archaeology is inherently political. Archaeology is about a past that at one point was used to amplify men in power. There was a shift after 1976 when the first studies of African American archaeology began to emerge. I've spent years excavating plantations and studying the horrors of agricultural slavery. But I knew almost nothing about industrial slavery until I learned about a forgotten cemetery. It was uncovered in 1977 in Maryland when a new highway was going through Frederick County. The cemetery dated from before the Civil War and contained the remains of more than 100 Black people. In that moment, the story a community tells itself changes. A mostly white area whose neighboring communities have witnessed the activities of the Ku Klux Klan has to come to terms with the forgotten part of its past. I want to find out what's been learned and what questions remain unanswered.
Hi, welcome. Thanks. So glad you're here.
Elizabeth Comer has studied and excavated this area for most of her life, carrying on the work of her mother.
Catoctin Furnace is a place that I've been involved with since I was about 4 years old. My mother was a historian, and she devoted years to writing 2 books about Catoctin Furnace, and she was really the first person to recognize that the enslaved people were part of the story. And so I became involved, helping my mother literally in the archives, making notes, and then I became a historian and an archaeologist. So it's very much become, a passion.
In the cemetery, some graves are marked by rocks, but there are no tombstones with names. Nothing to tell me about the people beneath my feet. So, my curiosity begins with the cemetery. Like, we're in the middle of the woods, there's a highway right here, and this is where these individuals were laid to rest. And why do you think it's here?
Well, the cemetery is right next to what would have been an active ore pit 200 years ago.
It turns out the cemetery was in the middle of the Catoctin Furnace, an industrial ironworks that makes everything from kitchenware to artillery, from the American Revolution until the 20th century. And for more than 60 years, Catoctin is worked by enslaved people, many of whom are buried here. But in its final decades, most of Catoctin's workforce is white.
So everyone in the village now is European American. They're the descendants of those white workers.
The enslaved fade from the community's memory. I don't really think the discovery of the cemetery was accidental. I don't believe in accidents. I think that in some ways, ancestors no longer want to be forgotten. After all my time excavating plantations, Catoctin is something new for me. Catoctin gives an example of an industrial place that is often overlooked. There's a familiar stereotype that African American slavery begins and ends with cotton. Catoctin shows us the story's more complex. I can't stop wondering, who were these enslaved people? What did they look like? And what happened to them? I learned the Catoctin Iron Works gets its start in the 1770s, when forges and furnaces run from New York and Pennsylvania down to Virginia and Maryland.
Catoctin is perfectly situated as an iron-making locale. We had excellent iron, and we still have iron ore very close to the surface here.
Iron's a way for rich white men to get even richer. Men like the four Johnson brothers of Maryland. They raise capital, get a deal on nearly 7,600 acres of government land, build Catoctin, and start turning out pots and pans for the Revolution in 1776.
Catoctin's pots were ready to go to the soldiers in order for them to make their dinner as they were on the march.
Like a lot of 21st century entrepreneurs, the Johnsons maximized profits by minimizing labor costs.
The Johnson brothers made a fortune, but they did it on the backs of the enslaved workers.
I've often read this idea of a silenced history, and being here, it's not silent at all. And I'm not talking about the highway that helped archaeologists to find this cemetery. I'm talking about the screaming that I can hear from the energy and the pain of the people who lived and loved and worked and died here. Elizabeth tells me that when the highway came through in the 1980s, the remains of more than 30 people had to be moved out of the path of construction. With no information about families to contact, the remains were put into the care of the Smithsonian Institution's anthropology lab for analysis.
We have high curation standards, we have controlled temperature and humidity controls, and there they were conserved to tell kind of the forgotten iron worker story. There is no other group of human remains that tell that kind of story.
Nice to meet you.
I meet renowned anthropologists Doug Owsley and Kari Brulhide. Using the latest scientific equipment, they're discovering much more than the original researchers were able to do.
When we're examining remains like this individual, we know that it represents the remains of a person. And we are very careful with these remains, and yet we also are looking at them with the eyes of scientists. We want to know,
Right.
who are you?
Right.
And what was your life like when they were building?
Doug and Kari say that DNA has been obtained from the bones of 27 people from the cemetery. The research is ongoing, but the genetic information has already confirmed sex and helped identify relationships within families. Taken together, the information from those 27 individuals helps paint a picture of a forgotten community of iron workers and their families.
That's a femur of a child about 3.5 to 4.5 years old. The curvature is a classic indicator of a condition like rickets. There's several children affected. So we know that there must be something going on that's affecting and impacting the health of very young children.
Is it nutritional deficits that they're not eating properly?
That's certainly a factor, but it's also sunlight.
Yeah, a major cause of rickets is that the kids don't get enough sunlight.
When the furnace was in production, there would have been a haze completely over the community.
It's clear the bones of older children show the kind of damage that comes from hard industrial labor.
this little cavitation in the center is a herniated disc. These multiple vertebrae indicate carrying loads, doing some sort of heavy physical labor, and this boy is only about 14, 15 years old.
A back that is bent before its time because as a teenage boy you are put to such heavy labor is more powerful than any artifact that I've excavated from the ground.
This elderly male would literally not have been able to stand up straight. That vertebrae would have been at a 90-degree angle.
His whole spinal column could have had essentially a broken back.
These remains tell the stories that aren't usually found on the paper trail of African American history.
There's nothing written in the archive. You go back and you run into that brick wall and there's just nothing.
All too often, we just show up as items on a list, like livestock. But Doug and Kari think a combination of science and art might restore at least some identity to the dead.
We're going to create a personal likeness, and I really believe in the process of forensic facial reconstruction.
It's something they've done for both law enforcement and for colonial sites like Levy Neck, Maryland and Jamestown, Virginia. These resin skull casts are the early stages for 3D facial reconstructions of the teenage boy with the injured back and a woman buried just below a 10-month-old baby, who according to the DNA was her infant son.
What kind of facial expression would she have? Would it be one of anger? Would it be one of steadfastness? Would it be one of sorrow?
It'll be a way to almost meet people whom nobody wrote about. To put skin on those bones and bring them back to life is more than powerful. But what are the others? According to the records, 271 enslaved people worked at Catoctin. Many more than are buried in the cemetery. Where did they go? Did they seek their own freedom? Or were they sold and dispersed in a way that we don't know? It's essential to find the descendants of the Catoctin furnace to connect the past with the present. Those are the answers that I'm searching for. The remains of people enslaved at Catoctin Furnace told me something of their suffering. Now I hope the remains of the ironworks will tell me about the industrial system that enslaved them. Catoctin, when I visited the actual site, it seemed overwhelming. It seemed much larger than I expected it to be.
So where we're standing, this is where the furnace at Catoctin stood here. The huge water wheel would have been right there, powering the bellows, opening and closing to shoot air into the fire.
It seems almost as if the Catoctin furnace itself is a city.
And across the street was the slave quarters.
The enslaved workers made the wealth of Catoctin and for the young United States. Our Industrial Revolution, it's traced here to places like the Catoctin furnace.
In the early years, it takes as many as 80 people to keep Catoctin running. Trees are chopped down to burn into charcoal. Then the charcoal's burned again, so men can separate metal from rock, and the iron can be shaped. It's impossible to separate the people that keep it running from the products that are produced. In the 1700s, it's possible that some Africans are captured because they already have a deep knowledge of ironworking. One piece of evidence is a Virginia advertisement for a recently captured African who's escaped. The ad says the man scarcely speaks any English, but can work at the smith's trade, having been employed in his own country in that way. People in this country don't know the tradition of iron forging on the continent of Africa that was happening way before colonization happened. In Africa, men who know how to work iron are an elite class. In America, they're higher priced property.
Ironmasters wanted skilled people and paid more money for blacksmiths.
So imagine you're snatched, you're bound, you're pulled, you're shipped. Everything that you've known your entire life is gone. America's Industrial Revolution doesn't exist without enslaved Africans and African Americans. But how to find out more about them, specifically those at Catoctin, when there are almost no written records? Just recently, Elizabeth Comer located a treasure trove of historical documents from the local Moravian church. More than 200 years ago, ministers such as the Reverend Friedrich Schlegel kept records of ceremonies performed for enslaved people, including baptisms, marriages, and burials. What information do we have?
These diaries and letters give us, for the first time, descriptions not only of birth, baptism, illness, and death at Catoctin, but also in surrounding plantations.
Nachmittag taufte ich eines Neger-Ehepaarte.
Reverend Schlegel's diaries and letters are written in Old German. A lot of them are only now being translated into English for the Catoctin Furnace Historical Society by Professor Edward Quinter.
I baptized a very sick child with the name Nicholas. Now here's where it becomes very interesting. I then visited a cripple who walked all bent over.
Right.
His attendant told me about him. He said the cripple got on his knees every night and prayed to God. He lives in great need. So, burial number 4 in the cemetery is a gentleman who fits this description.
Right.
Which tells us that he's alive in 1804.
Yes.
And that he's being taken care of by possibly a younger, African American who was looking out, for him.
It's a connection, a written confirmation of the human beings behind the bones. So I have to ask, are there names? How do we find the descendants?
We do know some names, mostly first names.
But having first names is almost no help in tracking down descendants. Reverend Schlegel performed burials too, probably for some of the enslaved in the cemetery. But those records don't help either.
The Moravians don't tell us the name of the person they're burying. They tell us the verse that they read at the service, and yet we're unable to know who that person is. Just tell us who they were.
The Reverend's writings are like flashes of light in the fog. New insights into the lives of the enslaved, but no clue to their descendants. Still, if some of these records were overlooked for 2 centuries, there may be other records out there and new ways to identify the dead. I feel like the story is unfolding. It continues. It doesn't stop at the cemetery. It doesn't stop at finding the remains of captive Africans. With no last names recorded, Reverend Schlegel's diaries aren't any help in finding the descendants of the enslaved buried at Catoctin. But back at Catoctin itself, the investigation gets some unexpected news. 2 people who say they're descended from Catoctin ironworkers find us. And they're a surprise.
My great-grandmother showed up on the census as black.
Wow.
Okay.
That was a part of the family I didn't know anything about. So I spent a lot of time and eventually found out that they lived up here on the hill above Catoctin Furnace.
My grandparents knew of my ancestry. And about 1960, I was laying in bed one night and I heard my grandparents say, "Don't you remember Eddie's grandfather was as black as the ace of spades?" So I was just, wow, what's that mean? Because to me...
Several years ago, Steve Pilgrim and Crystal Emery discovered they share several African-American ancestors from right around Catoctin.
Do you recall which census that was? What year?
That was 1910.
1910.
Genealogist Kimberly Morgan has joined our team. She looks into Steve and Crystal's paper trail and DNA history.
You've taken a DNA test. Do you know what percentage sub-Saharan African your DNA test shows? 3%. Okay. That lines up with the amount of DNA that you would inherit from, at least one ancestor who was a full African, great-great-grandparents. African-American genealogical research usually involves an abundance of indirect evidence, because direct evidence usually doesn't exist. But this is direct evidence. This is fantastic.
It complicates the story that we constantly tell each other about black and white.
Right.
Back in about 1980, one of my uncles still had an active KKK card at the time.
Wow, okay. A relative in the Klan and black ancestors. That's an American story.
I always wanted to know who my family was. And, I get choked up.
It's an amazing story, but how, once you understood that they were black, how did that make you feel?
I don't know. Blood's the same color. So.
We have the census, we have their names, we know the location of where they are, but are they directly connected to Catoctin? Elizabeth has cross-checked U.S. Census records with payroll books from Catoctin.
So,
She does find records of Steve and Crystal's ancestors working at Catoctin.
he was a collier. So he was in the woods making charcoal, and then obviously.
But the only records show a free man in the mid-19th century, decades after the last enslaved people vanished from the records of the ironworks.
The connection that we don't have yet is back to our enslaved cemetery here at Catoctin Furnace.
Steve and Crystal show it's possible that after emancipation, some African American families blended in with the surrounding population. But the link to the enslaved at Catoctin remains tantalizing and elusive. If only the remains from the cemetery could talk. Doug Owsley from the Smithsonian Anthropology Lab is attempting the next best thing with the help of Studio EIS in New York. The studio is famous for its remarkable facial reconstructions. Doug and Elizabeth meet with studio founder and director Ivan Schwartz and artist Jiwon Che to discuss reconstructing faces based on casts of 2 of the Catoctin remains.
These casts are made from the actual skull through computer tomography.
I can't tell this is a boy's skull.
Yeah.
And then definitely this is African features, yeah.
Yes.
This is the teenage boy whose spine was injured at Catoctin. He died around 1800. This woman died a generation after the boy. She's the one who had 1 son and 1 brother in the cemetery. Her brother a young boy, her son only a baby. Her bones show that because of problems in her jaw and in 1 hip, she lived in constant pain. While Che works, I wonder if some captives at Catoctin were able to escape like others did. From the early 1800s to 1863, as many as 30,000 people escaped to Canada or the northern states along the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was not only well-meaning Quakers and white folks. It started out as actually freed black people helping others get to freedom.
We have 16 freedom seeker ads from Catoctin from the time of the Revolution right up through 1837.
It's going to be a matter of looking at all angles.
I talk about the possibility of escape with two members of the African American Resources, Cultural and Heritage Society. The society researches the history of Africans and African Americans in Frederick County, including Catoctin.
Remember, Frederick is not that far from the Pennsylvania line. And so Pennsylvania, being a free state, was always a place that they can run to.
And I think that working in a furnace, you could find work because you have that skill.
There was a lot of value placed upon anyone, any enslaved person who was working within the iron industry. But then you see, we don't know for sure if there were actual individuals that left from Catoctin as a part of the actual Underground Railroad.
In fact, there doesn't yet seem to be absolute proof of any permanent successful escape from Catoctin. And that leads me to another mystery. There's no record of the fate of the last group of enslaved people at Catoctin when the furnace switched to an all-white workforce in the 1840s. After the shift of labor from black to white, where did they go? They did not just disappear. Kimberly Morgan has some ideas.
It's like working a cold case. You develop these theories and see how much evidence you can gather to support or disprove those theories.
Kim thinks we'll find answers if we follow the money along the trail of the slave trade. Kim and I head to Maryland's state capital, Annapolis. We're here because Kim has been following Catoctin's money trail.
The crux of the Catoctin mystery and the Catoctin story is money.
She's learned that times got tough at the ironworks after the original owners died.
Catoctin starts this pattern of changing hands. It also starts a pattern of severe financial troubles.
Which raises another possibility for what might have happened to the enslaved workers.
So let's see what they have.
Okay.
Thank you.
To learn more about Catoctin's owners and finances, Kim and I want to search the 19th century records at the Maryland State Archives. And we're helped by archivist Chris Haley.
So, what we're researching is there's this group of enslaved people who were at Catoctin Iron Furnace. Okay. Those people completely vanished from the paper trail. So where did those people go? And one theory that I personally strongly believe is that they were sold. And we're trying to find proof of those sales.
Gotcha. Are you related to these people?
No.
Not that we know of.
No, I'm not. Kim says that in 1841, Catoctin's latest owner, John McPherson Bryn, is $100,000 in debt. It's a tangled story. Bryn gets help from his wife's uncle, Robert Gilmore Jr., one of Baltimore's richest businessmen. Gilmore buys up all of Bryn's debt. Then,
John McPherson Bryn defaulted on the debt that he owed.
So Gilmore forces Bryn to sell Catoctin, but he lets Bryn keep his captive workers. Bryn owns another ironworks about 20 miles away called Antietam. He probably transfers his Catoctin captives there to keep making money from their skills.
We know that definitely some of them had very specific skill sets in working with iron, right? So they would have been considered more valuable because of that skill set.
But the economics of the iron industry are changing. Back at Catoctin, even though the new boss owns enslaved people, he staffs the furnace with free white labor.
You have this huge influx of people from Britain and Ireland who are willing to work for what's basically peanuts.
In the 1840s, cost-cutting capitalists don't see slavery as such a bargain anymore.
You had to feed them, you had to clothe them, you had to house them. Whereas with the white immigrant labor, even though you had to pay them money, you weren't having any of those other associated costs.
But what happened to the enslaved people from Catoctin who were moved to Antietam?
Hey, I have 3 files, Mr. Gilmore.
You want us to tackle one?
I'll tackle one. We search for information. Justice sculptor Ji-Won Che at Studio EIS searches for emotion in the reconstructed face of the woman from the Catoctin cemetery. Cultural historian Cheney McKnight adds a vital element.
If you left your house, your head was covered. And so these women may not have a beautiful bonnet that would have been afforded to free white women, but this is attempting to grasp at some type of humanity or cue to the rest of the world that I am a woman.
Back at the archives.
Oh wow.
Antietam Ironworks.
Bingo.
Was it?
This is Antietam, September 20th of 1848.
Has a Chancery Court record.
Valuable and extensive ironworks and a large body of... It looks like it takes just 5 years for financial troubles to arise at Antietam Ironworks.
So 150 working hands who have been discharged from employment there and whose wages to a large amount were due.
Oh.
He didn't make payroll. Antietam goes bankrupt in 1848. A year later, both Britton and Gilmore are dead. Court-appointed trustees decide to sell Antietam.
Those enslaved people could have been the fodder to pay off the debt.
Yeah.
I can see that.
Yeah. We don't find specific records about a sale of the enslaved people, but Kim and I sense we're close to an answer. We pass along what we've found to Elizabeth Comer and her team at Catoctin.
This made us at Catoctin Furnace look outside the box and look at Antietam. We were crossing the T's and dotting the I's.
And I remember that piece of advice I got.
It's going to be a matter of looking at all angles, of looking at these records that have been looked at before, but from a different perspective.
Yes. A few weeks later, Elizabeth tells me she and her team have news. Do we have any kind of proof that the enslaved that went to Antietam were then sold with the property itself?
When you were at the Maryland State Archives, you were on the right path, for sure. Let's look at this one in particular.
Before Antietam was sold, there was an inventory with several people originally from Catoctin listed as personal property, along with the furniture.
They list the enslaved, and there are 23 of them with a total value of $4,860. Private sale.
Elizabeth tells me that a local man named William Brown buys up the personal property at Antietam.
He bought everything from the store and a lot of the tools.
But there's no evidence in the sales documents that he also bought the enslaved people. Or is there? Were enslaved workers from Catoctin moved to the Antietam Ironworks and then sold? The answer has been hiding in plain sight since 1850.
One morning, I was just staring at this document, and all of a sudden this popped out at me. Amount of private sale of Negroes returned in inventory sold to William Brown.
So the enslaved were sold in a private sale from the widow of Antietam's owner to her neighbor. And 20 plus people are reduced to a line item and a lump sum.
I think this is why the Maryland State Archives didn't pop up, because one would expect a list of names.
Yes.
They're named in the inventory. So it wasn't until we found that one little tiny line that said that William Brown in a private sale purchased for $5,000 the enslaved of Antietam. That is where it all changes.
So what happens after? Do we have any more clues about what happened to them?
We do.
One name jumps out from the Antietam inventory. A 32-year-old iron worker named Henson Summers. He shows up 15 years earlier on an inventory at Catoctin.
Henson, worth $225.
Henson marries after leaving Catoctin.
His wife was on one farm, and Henson was at Antietam Ironworks in the nailery. So they were a fair distance away. But on the 1870 census, they are together with their children.
Henson Summers survived slavery to live as a free man with a family and had enough money to buy some land. Is it possible to find descendants because of being able to trace them to a certain point?
My dream was to have a Mayflower-like club of people who can trace their ancestry to the enslaved at Catoctin.
Yes.
The Summers family will be our first family because we have found them and we've traced them right through the generations.
Yes.
They're direct descendants of Henson. And
the new research has kicked a hole in the brick wall we've been running into. Did the descendants know anything about Catoctin?
They did not.
Yeah.
They had no idea.
I think the ancestors said, okay, it's time, since you want to tell the story.
There you go.
We'll show up.
So we're getting close. You can see we're going along Antietam Creek.
The next day, we go to where Henson Summers was once a captain, the former Antietam Ironworks, for a meeting at the inn that was once the Ironworks Company store. And at long last, we meet descendants of Catoctin's captives.
Want to sort of think about that. And
Sisters Sharon, Barbara, and Vicky, and their mom Agnes.
Finding the descent community for me has been a dream. I have goosebumps about this.
I don't know anything about my ancestors except for my grandfather. Even you didn't weren't brought up that much.
Much about that part of our ancestors.
And I don't know if it's because it was hard because it was slavery that they didn't want to talk about it a lot, but I just think it's fascinating to learn about history because I'm like, yeah, come on, tell me all I need to know. We started out looking at names at Catoctin and Antietam just to trace people through time.
Elizabeth lays out the documentary evidence of Henson being moved from Catoctin to Antietam, of his son Emery, and of Emery's descendants that led to the people at the table.
I have Henson's obituary. On the 9th of June, 1899, Henson Summers, colored, died in his 82nd year. He was employed at the Antietam Iron Works. He was noted for his great strength and thought nothing of wheeling a half-ton. And then here is his actual certificate of death.
For him to even be a color person, that you wouldn't even think he would even be listed.
Yes.
If he's anything like the rest of our family,
Yes, very strong.
he just was, with that strength, he helped a lot of people.
Yes.
In the next generation, we have a photograph of Emery. Emery is Henson's son. He's your ancestor. And there he is with his wife and children. And then we go through the family tree to you, Agnes.
Somebody named
my grandfather, Emery. You know, I'm not sure if it came from this Emery.
Yeah.
Oh, I think it did.
Not the eyes. That don't look like granddad.
Henson's descendants still live near where he once toiled at Antietam and Catoctin. One of the things that is important about Catoctin is iron work.
Yeah.
We brought that knowledge
Yes.
from the continent of Africa,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Miss Vicky, you okay?
Yeah. Better.
Check
Just emotional.
No, I feel you.
I'm emotional because this was, seriously, was not going to happen.
Yeah.
I talked to Mom, no, I don't want to do it. And then I said, I'm going to ask Sharon.
Yeah. I mean, you can go through the Bible and everything like that. There's so many people that were enslaved and mistreated, whatever, and I think it gives you power to know that we matter now and that we can move forward. Because when I look at what we did here, being skilled workers, that's just like blowing me away.
As a descendant of slavery myself, the names are so important because it gives us connections that we're not supposed to have, that have been taken away from us. I don't want to talk no more because I'm about to cry.
Right. And you know,
because Miss Vicky got
right? Just to know that, you know, we came down here, we visited so much here in Sharpsburg when we were little girls.
And to see our mother, who's a descendant,
Yes.
to witness this.
Yes.
And you know, the next step we're hoping at Catoctin is to be able to bring to bear the science of DNA from our enslaved cemetery, and then perhaps be able to trace back to specific places in Africa from which your ancestors were taken.
Right.
They ask the questions that are not. We've made progress.
Colored.
And friends. We've found new answers in old documents by asking new questions. Maybe this is the best way to uncover the past. As contemporary archaeologists, it's time to, for a minute, stop digging and re-engage with the very collections that have these question marks on them. We can't recover every lost story, every stolen life, but we can connect with fragments of the past. Here in Thurmont, at the Catoctin Furnace Historical Society's Museum of the Ironworker, after long months of work, are the reconstructed faces from the cemetery. The boy with the injured back, and the woman whose infant son died. They haven't come home. Home was Africa. But they're here, among the artifacts people like them made. This makes me feel full. And I can see so much reflected in these two faces. This is the humanity of people who were written off by, actually not written at all in history, right? It brings not closure, but it brings the circle just a little closer to a space that you can live with and be proud of.